Podcasts and other on-demand technology are allowing people to access entertainment, news, and even long-form journalism when and where they want. As more publishers are making their content available as podcasts or producing unique content for their podcast format, it's important to make sure that content is connecting with your audience. Alex Bennert outlines the key steps necessary to optimize your podcast for organic search.
The first thing that your podcast needs is an overview page. This is essentially the homepage for your podcast. There are certain components that the overview page needs to contain. The first thing is the podcast name. You also want to have a brief description of the podcast. This could be a couple paragraphs long, and it just conveys to the audience what the podcast is about. This is also a really good place to include words that will help you to rank for more generic types of queries, such as investigative podcasts or parenting podcasts, which allows you to attract new users. Next to the summary and description of your podcast, consider including an image. This is not an essential optimization component, but it is something that will make the page just more visually appealing. If you already have a custom branded image, that's great. If not, you can just use an image that has some sort of association with the topic of the podcast. So let's say it's a parenting podcast. You can find an image of a child and two grown-ups. Best practices are to include links to the most recent episodes. Of course, you also want to have a link to an archive that will allow users to find any of the previous episodes of your podcast. The links to the individual episodes are very simple. You just want to have the episode title, the episode number, and season number, if those are being used, a one-sentence description of what the episode is about, and one last thing you might consider is a thumbnail. Again, like the image, this is not an essential component of optimizing your page for search, but it is something that simply makes it more visually appealing to the user. Next, you should have an option to stream the most recent podcast and an option to download the most recent podcast. Also, you want to include a subscription option. For users that are new to podcasting, consider also including a basic how-to that explains exactly what they need to do in order to subscribe to a podcast. The last thing that you need is a title tag. A title tag is not part of the page that the user sees. It's in the code, but it's very important. This is what it shows up in the tab of your browser at the top of the page. But more importantly, it's used as the text link in the search result. So your title tag should be very straightforward. For the overview page, it should simply contain the name of your podcast as well as the word podcast and the producer of the podcast. You also need a meta description tag. So this is another element that the reader doesn't see on the page, but it is important. It's used in the search result often as a snippet of text below the linked text. My recommendation is to include your podcast name and one or two lines that simply describe what it's about. Make sure that you also include the word podcast. Once your podcast overview page is all set, now you need individual pages for each episode. Again, these pages will have essential components that they need in order to be well optimized for search. Some of these components will be identical from the overview page. This would be your host name or names that are linked to a bio page, the option to subscribe to the podcast via the user's preferred channel, as well as a link to your archive of your full back catalog of episodes. Individual elements that need to be included for the individual episode pages are as follows. The name of the episode, and ideally this should be essentially like the headline, so it should be within an H1 tag. Next, you're going to want to have the title tag, just like we needed for the podcast overview page. The title tag is not seen by the user. It's within the code, but it is a very important component. The title tag is one of the most heavily weighted factors in the ranking algorithm. My recommendation for title tags for individual episode pages is to start with the episode name, then followed by the word episode and the number of that episode, then the podcast name, followed by the word podcast. You're also going to need a meta description tag. This is another HTML component that's part of the code, and it's not seen on the page, but it does often become the snippet of text that shows up below the link in a search result. My recommendation for the meta description tag is to, again, include the episode name, the episode number, and the podcast name, and then also one or two sentences that summarize that particular episode. The next thing that you need is an episode summary. This should include descriptive words and phrases that are specific to key plot points. Note that episode pages will get indexed as an article in the news vertical if the body content has a minimum of 2 paragraphs placed within P tags and contains no less than 80 words, as well as a headline in an H1 tag that contains the episode name and number and season when applicable. The next thing I'm going to talk about is the featured image. On the individual episode pages, the featured image ideally is one that's relevant to that individual episode, such as a photograph of a person or a place, or a scan of a document like a floor plan. Lacking this, it's fine to just reuse the custom artwork. The last thing that you need is to include links to some other episodes. So you might just include the previous episode and the next episode once that's published, or you can just have a few links to other related episodes.
Thanks, Alex. Coming up soon, we will hear more from Alex on some advanced steps you should be following once you have the basics covered. Want us to let you know when we release the next podcast optimization video? Go to spokenmedia.com, scroll down to the bottom of the page, and sign up for our newsletter.